Hello everyone, this is Toby from the International Association for Political Science Students. We are here at the annual convention of the International Studies Association, and I'm here tonight with Jospeh Nye from Harvard University, and I'm really happy to talk to you today about the place of soft power in the 21st century. Before moving to the concepts and your work that you have done, I want to ask you something that is rather personal and go delve a bit deeper on your two professional careers that you had. You worked as a practitioner and you worked as a political scientist. How have these two professional careers influenced each other, and how do you think you have profited in your analysis and your capabilities through these two different approaches?
Well, I think government service or active politics is quite different from academia because you have much more pressure on time, and you're less able to just develop your intellectual curiosity. But on the other hand, it does enrich your understanding of how government really works. So, for example, earlier today, there was a panel about whether realism or liberalism explained the origins of the Iraq War. And I felt that the people who were some of the academics who hadn't had government experience were failing to realize that they're mixed motives. Many of the people were realists some of the time and liberal some of the time, and that their motives could run back and forth between the two. And while we often simplify our models to make it easier to understand the world, we shouldn't mistake our models for the reality of the world. And I think sometimes some of the people who haven't had any government experience, some of the academics sometimes make that mistake. So the points that I was trying to make is that from my experience, sometimes I would be acting as a liberal, sometimes as a realist, but it depended on the circumstances of the situations, and therefore to try to dichotomize it's either one or the other doesn't make much sense. And I try to say this in the textbook I wrote on understanding international conflict and cooperation, but I also describe myself as a liberal realist, as a way to show that you need both. And that I think I would not have done if I hadn't had the experience in working in government.
So do you consider yourself an outsider in the discipline, or?
Well, I'm certainly not a complete outsider. I've been around for a long time, but I've never aspired to be president of the Political Science Association or something of that sort. But I still go to the meetings, the ISA meetings, such as this one. I like interacting with my colleagues. I learn a lot from that. So I don't consider myself an outsider, but I don't consider myself an academic politician either.
When you were in office and working, advising the government or working even within, how important were political science concepts for you working in there?
Well, they actually were very useful because, as Henry Kissinger once observed, you don't have time in government to build up your intellectual capital. You have to spend the intellectual capital you've developed before. So I found myself, when I was in the State Department, handling non-proliferation policy, for example, drawing on concepts of interdependence and networks and things that I had studied or worked and written about as an academic, and then using them to shape policies. And similarly, when I was in the Clinton administration as Assistant Secretary of Defense, responsible for developing an Asian policy or strategy, I looked at both my insights into realism, which I had developed as an academic or written about in my textbook, and also liberalism. So I was kind of surprised once when I went to Wikipedia and saw myself listed as a co-founder of the school of neoliberalism. I never considered myself that. I thought of myself, as I said, as a liberal realist. I tried to do both. I didn't feel that the wisdom was in one camp or the other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is also interesting because your main work hasn't been going into one of these two discourses, but to develop concepts that were actually pretty well applicable in political science, and still are. Your main concept that you're popular for is soft power.
Mm-hmm.
How or when did you develop this concept?
Well, I was writing a book in 1989, which was a reply to Paul Kennedy's book, The Rise and Fall of the Great Powers, in which he argued that the United States was in decline and that this was it was a situation like Philip II Spain or Edwardian England or something. And I didn't think that was quite right, and I thought that the Americans had more power resources than Kennedy gave them credit for, and I sort of totaled up the military balance and then the economic balance. And I said, but there's still something missing, which is the ability not just to coerce or to pay others, but the ability to attract others, to get them to want what you want. And that gave rise to this concept of soft power. And so it was originally designed as an idea to try to explain some of the power resources that the United States had, and that I felt that Paul had not paid enough attention to. But it's been taken up, much to my surprise, by political leaders. So you now have Xi Jinping, the president of China, talking about China's need for soft power. Mm-hmm. So I never expected that when I was trying to develop this concept as an analytical concept.
Mm-hmm. Before going to my next question, I also want to invite all our listeners and viewers at home to also raise your questions if you have any. Please feel welcome to write them into the comments. And actually, you raised a very interesting point about China claiming, or also researchers claiming, China to have soft power. Would you agree with this general claim or disagree?
Oh, I think China does have soft power. If you look at the extraordinary performance of the Chinese in raising hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, a lot of people are attracted to that and admire that. And another example would be traditional Chinese culture, which is very attractive to others, and the Chinese develop soft power from that. I think what problems that China has on soft power is more in the lines of their intense concern about party control of civil society, and that means they can't unleash the full talents of Chinese civil society. So a Liu Xiaobo gets locked up rather than used properly, or Ai Weiwei, who's a great artist, is basically not able to work at home in China. And I think this has hurt China, and that their soft power would be greater if they would loosen up a bit, relax the constraints on civil society, because a lot of soft power really comes not from government but from civil society. And the other problem that China has is it has a number of territorial disputes with its neighbors, and it's very hard to be attractive if your ships, your warships, are chasing somebody else's fishing boats out of contested waters. So you can set up a Confucius Institute to promote Chinese culture, but if at the same time your ships are chasing away the other country's fishing boats, the Confucius Institute probably doesn't produce much attractive soft power.
Mm-hmm. But would you say that soft power is a concept that only liberal democracies can use, or
Oh, no, not at all. I mean, you can, soft power means the ability to get what you want through attraction rather than coercion or payment. But Osama bin Laden had soft power. He didn't coerce people to fly into the towers or pay them. He attracted them with his version of his ideology. Many people think it was distorted ideology and that it led to mass murder, but nonetheless it attracted people. So soft power. Soft power is not good per se. I do think in relation to liberal democracy that if you have a desire for more democracy, for relaxing an autocracy, then that can produce soft power for the country that represents it. But for example, I don't think liberal democracy doesn't produce much soft power, let's say, in a traditional monarchy like Saudi Arabia.
Looking at classical liberal democracy, the European Union is supposed to be the regional organization, or as a union, to represent kind of a something that puts soft power into the world, that reflects soft power. Is the European Union successful or not successful?
Well, I think the European Union has been an enormous success over the years. If you think of Europe today, you can't imagine Germany and France going to war as they did 3 times in 70 years. And it has produced a Europe which allows people to live without the constant fear of the breakdown into warfare that once was normal in Europe. So for that alone, it's been a success. It's also been good for European prosperity, and I think that developed a degree of soft power for Europe. I think more recently there's been this problem of, have the gains from European unity been adequately distributed across the population, and this has given rise to certain populist reactions against Europe. And there's also the problem of immigration, which has created a cultural backlash, which increases population, the feeling that Europe as a whole has not been able to do enough in terms of restricting migration. So Europe has some problems which have limited its soft power recently, but looked at over a longer period, I think Europe is a huge success, and I think many people are attracted by that.
When you talked about the US, you said the US had a lot of soft power. Does it still have the same amount of soft power, or has
the US has a good deal of soft power that comes from civil society. I think what we've seen is the US soft power goes down after Bush's invasion of Iraq in 2003, recovers somewhat under Obama, and then it basically goes down again under Trump. I mean, and so there is a soft power 30 index, which is published by Portland in London, and U.S. was ranked first last year, but then dropped to number 3 this year. So that plus public opinion polls can show that there has been a decline in U.S. soft power. But on the other hand, most of U.S. soft power doesn't come from the government. It comes from universities, from Hollywood, from foundations, and so forth. That hasn't declined. The attraction to U.S. creativity, to Silicon Valley, to universities like Stanford and Harvard, those haven't changed.
Do you see a problem also that comes out of soft power? So talking, for example, about U.S. Universities or Hollywood that may contribute to certain dominance or hegemony that creates through different effects, anti-Americanism, for example, that hurts the own soft power.
Well, anti-Americanism has a long distinguished tradition in Europe and elsewhere. In Latin America, it's very clearly understandable from periods of U.S. intervention and overt hegemony. But even in Europe, there was a cultural anti-Americanism. These brash Westerners were resented, and Hollywood films were regarded as less cultured than French films and so forth. So there is a long tradition of resistance to American culture and American policies, and that's natural. But I don't think it hasn't overwhelmed the American soft power. I mean, but it's not surprising there to be some reaction against it.
Since your concept has been mentioned the first time and you developed it and have written it down till now, have you experienced some thoughts of rethinking or reconsidering certain aspects of it, or are there certain dimensions that must be added from what you...
Well, there's recently there's been a study by the National Endowment for Democracy, which has developed what they call the concept of sharp power, by which they mean manipulative power to penetrate other countries. And some people mistook that for soft power because it was intangible, but it's not the same as soft power. Soft power is the ability to get what you want through attraction and persuasion, and this idea of sharp power is essentially getting what you want through manipulation. And so I would not change the definition of soft power, but I would admit that manipulation is an aspect of power that's of some significance.
Talking about this kind of power, and also looking back at your professional career, you have not been only working in the realm of diplomacy only, but also in the defense ministry. Right now, we observe that, particularly in the US, but also in other countries, the ranking of the defense ministry, in contrast to the State Department or the Foreign Ministry, is going up again. And this is seen as a possible loss for diplomacy, but also for soft power. How do you see it, thinking about that you have been working on soft power, but in this defense context?
Well, I think it's ironic that in the Trump administration, they've bragged about having a hard power budget, and they have urged the slashing of the State Department budget by 30%. And what's ironic is that the Secretary of Defense, James Mattis, is a general, or was a general, has said, if you cut the budget of the State Department, you're going to have to buy me more bullets. He said, we need the soft power. So there's a internal incoherence within the Trump administration on this. And when things are working well, you have cooperation between the Defense Department and the State Department, and that produces, I think, what I call smart power, the ability to combine hard and soft power successfully. But I think the Trump administration has failed that test.
What would you recommend a U.S. administration at this point, for example, or any administration, to reconcile or to further develop soft power?
Well, I would fully fund the various exchange programs like Fulbright Exchange and other young leaders programs. I would make much greater efforts to provide for assistance to public health internationally, with the World Health Organization, for example. I'd make much more efforts to finance and fully finance the U.S. Agency for International Development. These are all things which have been cut by the Trump administration. I think it's a big mistake.
All right. Thank you very much for as a last question, and also considering the fact that we have a lot of students watching here to us right now, I want to ask you, when would you recommend a student who's right now considering to either go into something something theoretical, to become a scholar, or to, for example, run for a State Department career or something? How do students find out?
Well, I think if you want to have an academic career, you need to nail down your academic credentials first. You have to do a doctorate. You have to publish articles and referee journals. Some people might say it's paying your dues. After that, then you can have, you might take time and go into the State Department, as I did. I think if you're interested in being able to return to academia, then you really have to do the work of publishing and making your mark on peer-reviewed publications. But you may not want to have that type of career. You might want to have a more active career. And in that case, you don't need a PhD. You can go into a government job and become active and have influence at an earlier stage. So it really depends on what you want for the long run.
Mm-hmm. Professor Nye, thank you a lot for being here with us today, for taking the time after probably a long day at the ISA annual convention to talk to us. We are very glad that we had you here.
It was my pleasure.
And yeah, have a good stay here.
Thank you very much, and good luck to everybody who might be listening.